Hello, everybody. Hi, Colleen.
Hi.
Welcome. And we are very excited to welcome back today Justin Stein. Hi,
Hi,
Justin.
good
Hi,
morning.
Justin.
Good morning. So we've had Justin on the podcast twice now, right, Justin?
Mhm.
Yeah. He is an incredible Reiki scholar, historian, and has written several books now or edited this one about Reiki. We had him on for his first one before. If you haven't listened to that episode or episodes, go back and listen to them. They are extraordinary. And we are here today to have him on about his new book, which he edited, Reiki and the Benevolent Art of Healing. So I am holding that up for those of you that are watching this. Both Colleen and I have a copy of it, and you can find it on Amazon, also your local bookstores. But we got ours on Amazon because we wanted to get it in quickly. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. It's originally, well, actually, Justin, I'm going to have you talk about, who it's written by. Then I know we want to make sure that we're giving credit to the translator, all
Mhm.
of those kinds of things. You're obviously going to talk about that a lot easier than I am. So we're excited
Good.
to have you on. And we have several other topics that we're going to cover today as well. But we're always so thankful for all your work that you do documenting Reiki's history and all of that. So good morning.
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, it's great to be back. Always love talking with both of you about this stuff. We always seem to the time always flies by when we're having these conversations. Yeah, so we have this new book just came out, as well as some other new materials that have come to light. So yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about all of that today. So the book is a translation of a Japanese book called Reiki to Jinjutsu, and that title is a kind of play on a Japanese and a Chinese expression that medicine is an art of benevolence, right? Medicine is an art of caring for others, of being benevolent, and which is one of the Confucian values. And so, yeah, our translator, Dylan Lewis Toda, who's a wonderful translator, this is a pretty difficult text, even just to read like pieces of, let alone to translate the original Japanese is, 300 something pages. And so he really, jumped into this project. Thankfully, Brian Brunius, Reiki Centers of America, Diane DeMonden, who used to be part of that, also helped with these fundraising events in order to pay Dylan, right? Because he's a professional. He's not a Reiki practitioner himself. He wasn't volunteering for this. We raised this money to pay, this professional translator trained at Japanese universities, does a lot of work with Buddhist texts from the same time period, and yeah, to bring this text to the global audience. It's a text that Japanese Reiki masters have told me, like, wow, this is like, you know, maybe the most, or certainly one of the most important books in Japanese, that we have describing kind of early Reiki. But and they would say, even for me, this highly educated Japanese kind of older generation who, knew these, can read these kind of pre-war characters and maybe knows some of these older expressions, but they would say, even for me, this is a difficult book to read. Because I would say, man, it's Tomita. That's a tough. I know you're saying it's such a good book, but it's a tough to read. It's like, oh yeah, even for me, it's hard to read. So,
It's meaty for sure. Even in
yeah,
English, it's meaty. So
yeah, well, it's definitely a lot more accessible the way that Dylan and also the back and forth as well. Dylan would send me a draft, and then I would, sit down with the original Japanese and sit down with his translation and say, oh, in this part, like I think get really in the weeds,
I bet.
about word choices or things like that. So, yeah, we worked for years to try to bring this and make it as accessible as possible. And yeah, I think there's a lot in there in terms of Reiki practice, right? Kind of a very different maybe lineage than what's come to us in some ways. And then also Reiki philosophy, how does it work? And then also, of course, I mean, half of the book about is different ailments and what kinds of hand positions might be good for them, and thinking about the way that Reiki interacts with different physiological systems in the body, and yeah, there's just a lot in there.
Why don't we start by exactly what the book is?
Sure.
So, who Tomita is
Yeah.
and what the book is.
Yeah. So, Tomita Kaiji was a Reiki practitioner before World War II. He first studied in the mid 1920s at the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai branch in Osaka. He doesn't specify who his teacher was. He says the teacher came from Tokyo, and this was in a period when Usui Sensei was still alive. And he speaks very highly of Usui Sensei and has some details about his teachings that don't appear anywhere else. So I think it's likely that his teacher was Usui, but it is possible it was one of Usui's other disciples. It's not entirely clear. Um, but yeah, he was. So I think this is the only real book of its kind where we have other, um, texts. One of Usui's disciples, Tomobechi Gizo, wrote in his memoirs a chapter about Usui and about Usui practice. But it doesn't go into so much detail like this does. And so, in terms of like a full length book that seems to largely be based on Usui's teachings, as well as the author's own experiences with Reiki and maybe some ways where he adapted the practice, this book is really one of a kind. Um, Tomita went on to write several other books, and his practice and ideas and teachings seem to have evolved over time. But this book is the earliest of that kind of series, and so it really seems to be the closest to understanding Usui Reiki Ryoho kind of through his eyes.
It really reads so much because it was like a manual for him, right? Like it was a manual that he is that the best way to in modern terms kind of describe it, or would you say differently?
I think it's not, it's like a manual, but I wouldn't say it's exactly a manual, right?
Yeah.
The beginning, it yeah, because I think there's a lot of kind of his own speculation and philosophy and stories and experiences, case histories, and things that you wouldn't necessarily put into a manual. But the chapter four, which is like, as I said, kind of half the book, that part is quite manual-like. So I think it includes kind of a manual, but I think it also has more than that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like he really shares, as you call them, case studies, his stories about the practice, because also in the context of modern medicine back then, being in the developmental stages, just like everywhere, just like today. Um, anyway, that this was so much of the medical practices that he was using it that way.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it's part of the reason why Reiki and other therapies, similar therapies at that time, were in demand was the government had, you know, um, prohibited certain types of folk medicine that had existed previously to promote biomedicine, but biomedicine couldn't address all of the problems in society, and also it was expensive. And so new types of kind of folk medicine, in a sense, arose that had more modern influences along with some traditional influences. And that's, Usui Reiki Ryoho is kind of at that confluence of traditional aspects, including maybe some of the recitation practices or the meditations, the use of symbols, the use of initiations, which interestingly, right, that Tomita doesn't have initiations, right? It's all about almost self-initiation, which, has been a very controversial thing in the Reiki world. And here it's like, oh, in 1933 Japan, this guy is kind of encouraging people to do a kind of self-initiation ritual, which is super interesting. But then there's also these modern ideas about energy and about, ways where and transnational influences, things coming from the U.S. in terms of maybe the power of the divine mind and aligning one's own mind with the divine mind. These are things that are kind of newly brought into Japan, and so these early 20th century therapies are kind of combining local practices with a long history there with new ideas from modern science and also from Western influences as well. So yeah, I love you're getting me excited about something that I've been researching for a long time, and I love talking about. Yeah.
Well, I think it's actually a really good tie-in to explain that transnational part of it
Mm.
before him and where you're seeing that in the book and his practices, because I think that is not a well-known part of the history.
Yeah,
And starting with, Meiji opening up Japan to the West. If you could kind of go
sure.
through that process, I think it's really important. And, I want to make sure we mention your other book, Alternate Currents, that you wrote about the transnational um, aspect of Reiki and the influence of it.
Yeah, sure. So briefly, Japan was kind of forcibly opened in the mid 19th century, that they had been kind of mediating their relationship with the outside world on their own terms for centuries. So the Dutch were allowed to trade in Nagasaki. They had some trade with the Chinese and the Koreans, but it was all on their own terms. And then in the 1850s, US warships start showing up, and they'd had some other skirmishes with the British and the Russians, and all of a sudden, this empire, that had been, this archipelago that had been fairly isolated from the world, with some, uptake of Western science and anatomy and medicine through the Dutch, but all of a sudden, it's really just opened up, and Japanese people are studying abroad. Western missionaries and scientists and experts in various fields are being brought in. And so this Meiji period is this very fertile period of kind of cross-cultural exchange. And the idea in Japan is usually, that we're going to take Western technology and improve upon it with the Japanese spirit, right? The Japanese spirit and the period was kind of romanticized as superior, or there's a very strong nationalist strain going on at the time. The emperor, imperial family promoted as divine, and so emperor worship is also like one of these influences at the time. But there's also a great interest in things coming from abroad, and so hypnotism, mesmerism, right, healing by laying on of hands. These are things that are popular in the late 19th century US, and they get taken up in Japan. And also the idea, what's called the New Thought movement or Christian Science as well, the idea that illness in the body, that misfortune is a failure to align one's mind with the divine mind, is another really important movement, idea in U.S. religion around the turn of the 20th century. What we now call the law of attraction or things like that, right, root from that period in time. And it seems that one of Usui Sensei's major influences was this other what I call like spiritual therapist around that time, who had was a philosophy professor who had gone to Harvard to study and seems to have been exposed to Christian Science, learned about it, and brought it back to Japan. And in his introduction or his foreword to this book, one of these Japanese Reiki teachers who had originally republished this book in Japan about 25 years ago, Toshitaka Mochizuki, um, writes about how a student of his had given him an old version of one of Tomita's books that had a piece of paper stuck in it that wasn't published in the book, but it seems to have been a flyer that Tomita distributed in his class. And that's reproduced in Mochizuki's forward. And it says basically things that sound very, very similar to kind of Christian Science teachings. That there's a practice in the book, the Nentatsuho, which is a way of kind of healing the mind, where it involves putting a hand on the forehead and kind of doing positive affirmations. And there's a passage that's in Mochizuki's forward. I can't quote it off the top of my head, but it's about that, to basically align your mind with the divine mind, that illness is an illusion, that disease is an illusion, right? These kind of very clearly Christian Science influenced type of expressions. And so it's coming in through there for sure, and also from the five precepts, right? That the Usui Sensei's, this is not for the Tomita book, this is in my other book, and also I plan to write about this more for this other article or chapter that I have in the works. But the five precepts that Usui Sensei taught, kyo dake wa ikaru na, just for today, do not anger. Shinpai suna, don't worry. Kansha shite, be grateful. Gyo hageme, do your work well. Hito ni shinsetsu ni, be kind to people. That was borrowed from this other therapist who was teaching this kind of Japanized form of Christian Science. And so this whole process of like affirmations, of saying kind of positive statements about what you want your life to be like in order to change your heart or change your mind, that you change the mental or spiritual aspect first, and then the physical will follow, right? All of this seems to, with also maybe some influences from Japanese culture, but really be brought in from kind of American thought and practice at that time. So yeah, in the Tomita book, as well as in some of Usui Sensei's teachings, we see aspects of this kind of new thought, power of the mind, trying to align with the divine mind. And actually, if I could say one more thing, because there's
Keep
another part
going.
of
Yeah,
the
tell
book
us all.
that I find really interesting in this regard. In the chanting of the imperial poetry called Gyosei, so he teaches this as part of Hatsureiho, right? The practice of awakening Rei or Reiki in the body. And he talks about, Gasho meditation for long periods of time, sitting in Seiza, kneeling, Gasho, breathing, aligning one's breath with one's hands and also with one's lower belly, the hara, and that this kind of alignment within the body creates purification. But he also talks about reciting the poetry of the Meiji Emperor, which we know Usui Sensei taught as well. And the gyosei that appear in the book also appear in this book that was distributed within the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai at the time. So we know, he got this practice from the Gakkai. But he has a really interesting line where he talks about how reciting the gyosei purifies one's heart mind, one's kokoro, because it gets illuminated by the divine heart mind of the emperor. That the Meiji emperor, who's passed away and has now, left the physical world and become, a full kami, right? That at Meiji Shrine in Tokyo, where Usui Sensei built his dojo, his main dojo in Harajuku, very close to Meiji Shrine. Olaf, in his book, we talked about last time, Olaf Bum's book, has a photo of Usui and some students at the Meiji Shrine. And so we know that the Meiji emperor devotion and worship even was important to early Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. But the way that Tomita talks about it, that the emperor's divine heart mind illuminates the heart mind of the individual practitioner, right? Really, I think has that same sort of resonance between like the divine mind and the individual mind that you see in 19th, early 20th century US, but with a very Japanese, nationalist, emperor worship take on it, right? And he does say in that chapter, you don't have to use this poetry. Like that this is something that's helpful in my practice. It's something that I was taught. But if you have other spiritually inspiring literature from your own tradition, he talks about if there's like a Buddhist he doesn't say Christian, but he does say if there's a Buddhist thing that you find personally inspiring, and I'm sure, obviously reading this for our own benefit, I'm sure Christian, Hindu, like, a non-affiliated spiritual teacher that, the wisdom of their words has, carrying this kind of divine spark or something like that, being able to illuminate your own heart mind and purify your own heart mind. That he's saying, I think in the book, I thought this was really interesting too, that in his world, that he's found this connection with the Meiji Emperor, but it doesn't have to be the Meiji Emperor, right? And so I thought that was interesting that he included that as well.
One of the podcasts that we did with Ken Locke, gosh, I don't know why his last name isn't popping up, but Ken Locke talking about, what is it, Robin?
Jung?
Yes.
Jung?
Yes.
Or is it pronounced Young?
Anyway, he talks about Chokurei, and that was the original intention of Chokurei, was to connect with that divine energy of the emperor.
I've seen that interpretation before, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, well, I love that connection with all of it, tying it together, because it is like you guys are bringing in with Olaf's book and your books and, the CV coming out of Taiwan and more that is being discovered all the time. It's really tying together like well, the evidence-based history, but a more accurate awareness of the culture at the time.
Right.
Because for me, there was always that mythical part of it.
Yeah, and I think with that comes this idea that like we don't have to do things like it's good to understand how it used to be done. Like we can learn from that, but we don't have to also like try to slavishly recreate the way people were doing things 100 years ago either. That there's ways where the practice could adapt or evolve in ways that are beneficial for modern practice as well. So I know there are people out there chanting gyosei, imperial poetry that find real meaning in that practice. There's talk of the kotodama, right? The spiritual vibrations of those words. But I think also, even in 1933, Tomita was saying, hey, if you've got something else that speaks to you more, you can use that too, right? And so I think that that's really nice to see, like even in that early period and understanding that cultural context, that there was this understanding like, hey, this can continue to evolve and adapt for different people's needs and contexts.
Which is interesting because this might be conjecture, but it's interesting because you would think that if that was what he was passing on, that would be also how he learned, right?
Yes.
That it is okay for this.
Oh,
Does that make sense? Or do you
yeah,
think that maybe
it's
that is him?
possible. I think that might be him though. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I don't have any evidence that the Gakkai really ever incorporated other like the gyosei, the imperial poetry is still the practice in the
Yeah.
Gakkai, right? I mean, I can't say too much about that, but like
Yeah.
their publications continue to contain although they changed which poems. That the pre-war poems, there's some very patriotic ones in there. And the post-war publications, they don't use those ones anymore. They picked more kind of universal, positive, neutral, spiritually inspiring ones, and not, the Yamato Damashi, the spirit of the Japanese people. That all of those they kind of let go of. So even there's evolution at the same time that there's also tradition,
Lots of tradition.
in that
Okay.
society. Yeah.
Interesting.
But yeah, I think that might be Tomita's own thing. Yeah, yeah, because
His own practice.
he certainly, I mean, the whole fact that there's no Reiju talked about in the book is kind of surprising to me. I remember like reading it and working on it with Dylan and just being like, yeah, I guess it just never comes up that like he really believes that you just do Gasho meditation, and after 1 week of that, and actually very interesting. I mentioned this in my book, but I think it's maybe in a footnote or something so it's only for the readers who go really deep into the book that might find this gem. But I talked to a Japanese American guy from Hawaii whose mother-in-law was a Reiki practitioner who learned from Takata, and he wanted to learn Reiki, and she didn't really know how to initiate him. And so he did Gasho meditation every day for a week. And at the end of the week, he had this experience where he started like shaking and his hands got really hot. And after that, he was able to do Reiki. And so I don't know if this idea of doing Gasho meditation every day for a week is something that Takata also transmitted to early Japanese American Reiki practitioners. And then kind of she stopped teaching that as initiation really became the central thing. I know in her early practice, she was giving Reiju like regularly at meetings. But this idea of the Gasho meditation seems like that may have been an early transmission to Hawaii that then later didn't really, continue. But this idea that Reiju is helpful, right? The Reiju, for listeners who don't know, is the Japanese ceremony that is kind of the basis for what today we call Reiki initiations. Um, but that Reiju is helpful, but maybe it's not entirely necessary if you're a dedicated practitioner doing Gasho meditation daily, that there is a way that you can actually just awaken Reiki in yourself through Hatsudeho, and part of which is the Gasho meditation. That seems to be what Tomita is saying, and also it was the experience of this one individual in Hawaii as well. And so, yeah, it's kind of an interesting alternate path of Reiki lineage outside of the initiation lineage as well. Yeah.
Well, I've actually asked the energy of Reiki about that, not this specific topic because I wasn't aware of this way, but and because people ask all the time, well, why do we need to take a Reiki class if all of us have this in us already?
Right.
And what I've received from the energy of Reiki is because we believe we do, and that
We believe we need the class.
we need the, no, yes, that we need the initiation,
Yeah.
and part of what, like as a collective, we have a belief that we need that intermediary,
Yeah.
we need all of these things. And of course, knowing what we know, and having studied shamanism for so many years and all of the very difficult practices that I practiced, a lot of the challenging. There's so many blessings with the attunement too,
Mhm.
and then the training that goes with it.
Right.
So I can understand how that could happen. At the same time, the other practice that he talks about is the Seiza. Am I saying that correctly?
Mhm.
So I physically would not be able to do that.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. Yeah. I feel like I agree with everything you just said. I that resonates with me very strongly that on one hand, the initiations, the training gives you the confidence, right? Gives you this feeling like, okay, I can do this. I've been trained. Even after the course, right? Lots of students still are, not entirely confident about, oh, can I
Mhm.
really, this is just, a few days of learning and I can really, do this practice, it's like, and I think you have to build that confidence through experience as well. But yeah, I've definitely had that thought before that like, hey, if you just practice, you're gonna learn to do it. But on the other hand, like you said, the blessings you receive in the ritual, the experience that you can tap into from your teachers' teachings, right? And that hopefully, I mean, depending on who your teacher is, that you can contact them if you have, experience any questions or challenges, that you have now a mentor in a sense. You're tapped into a human network that can support you on your journey, right? That's very different than reading a book or reading an article on the internet and then, kind of tapping into the connection with Reiki itself. Depending on how intuitive one is, maybe Reiki can also be one's guide and one's teacher. But I think having those human allies and mentors can be really helpful and supportive as well. So I think there's definitely a reason why people take Reiki classes, even if the Reiki energy is universal and accessible to all. But I think I may have mentioned on this podcast before, my grandmother was saying, "Oh, I was doing Reiki before anybody was talking about it
Yeah.
because, my kids would fall down, I put my hands on their knee, the hands would get hot, the knee would feel better, and then they go off and run away. And so, yeah, obviously
Exactly.
people have been doing this a long time without initiation or, yeah.
Yeah, I think part of it for me, again, all of the different things that I've done and vision quests and, just very hard practices to gain that connection.
Mhm.
It's so nice to have the attunement.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I think that's one of the things that Usui, he spent 21 days on the mountain fasting to get this, and he brought this attunement to people saying, you don't have to do that. Like there's an easier way. And I think that's a very kind of part of that, what I would say is like the modern aspect of this practice is right. People working in the city aren't necessarily going to go up into the mountains and fast for 3 weeks in order to be able to cure their stomach aches or help their children or whatever, like that kind of burden is something I think that again, most people are not going to do. But Reiki really is like for everybody, right? It's this like democratizing or this, egalitarian kind of thing, where yeah, it just takes maybe the investment of taking a class and then you have it for your lifetime. Yeah.
yeah.
Justin, where did this book come from and how did it come to you?
Okay, great questions. I always love coming on this show. You always um,
The
so
difference of questions too sometimes.
yeah.
Differences in
So,
questions.
so as I said, it was republished in 1999. It was originally published in 1933, and it was republished in 1999 by Mochizuki Sensei, who wrote one of the forwards for the book. And he, I think, found it because he got into Reiki in the mid 1990s, and then I think was part of that generation of 1990s researchers who were saying, okay, where does this practice come from, and trying to dig through, he as a Japanese man, obviously, could had maybe access to things that maybe someone like Frank R. Java Petter or other, William Lee Rand, like other researchers at that time weren't going into Japanese used bookstores to find, early documents necessarily. Although Arjava did have a Japanese wife at the time, so maybe I'm not entirely sure about that. But so he found this book. Reiki is in the title, and he realized this is a super important book. And he also republished some other books from another lineage, the Eguchi Mitsui lineage, which we have a little bit of scholarship about, and there's going to be more coming out. I'm working on another, sorry, the tangents, but I'm working on another edited volume right now. It's going to be called A Century of Reiki, and we're going to have a chapter on the Eguchi Mitsui lineage as well in there. But yeah, Mochizuki Sensei um, republished a number of books around this time in the late 90s, early 2000s, historical books by um, you know spiritual healers, spiritual therapists who had studied Usui Reiki Ryoho and then developed um, practices. And so I trying to remember how I first encountered it. I probably first encountered it on the internet through writers like Rick Rivard and oh man, James Deacon and Franz Stina, who were looking into Reiki history and making available a lot of this information that was coming out of Japan through people like Hiroshi Doi and others. And so I think in the mid 2000s, websites like the Reiki Threshold or All Energies Therapy Web, AETW, I don't know if you remember that one, James Deacon's Reiki pages. And International House of Reiki, Franz Tina's blog, that I think that's how I started becoming aware of it. And then when I started learning Japanese to the level where I could actually, maybe read through a few pages of it. So I think in the early 2010s, I got a copy of it on like Amazon Japan, the republished one. The original copies are very hard to find. Although recently, one has been, I guess, donated to or acquired by the National Diet Library in Japan, which is like their like Library of Congress. So if you want to go like touch an original 1933 pressing, they have one at the library you can go access. Um, but yeah, and so then I think in the mid 2010s, I was kind of like aware this is an important book, and I started reading it a bit myself. And then in the late 2010s, I was contacted by some Reiki masters from New York City. So I think Diane DeMondon was the first one to contact me, and then also Brian Brunius, her teacher. And they were very interested in Tomita, and they originally translated, there's like a short thing from this other book where there's like a chapter on Tomita. It's not his own writing, but it's like kind of a little summary maybe of that chapter about Seiza and like the self-practice. And so they had that translated, and then they were like, well, how can maybe we can translate the whole book. Would you want to translate the book? And I was like, no way. I've got so much else on my plate. It's
No.
very time consuming, and I'm not sure, I wouldn't want to take on that project. And they said, well, do you know anyone who would? And so that's how we started. And that was started, I guess, right during the pandemic. We had these fundraiser events that was called A Century of Reiki as well, and where I kind of gave a series of webinars on the history of Reiki, and the money raised through those webinars was used to pay Dylan to translate the book. And yeah, so that, I mean, was about 5 years ago, right? And so it's definitely been a long journey to get to where we are now. Just the last little stage was trying to figure out about the copyright, and in the end we decided, okay, it's public domain. Like we can do it, because it was the question was, oh, it was republished, and Mochizuki, we're like, oh, can you give us the rights? I said, well, I don't know if I have the rights. I think it's public domain. So that took a little while to figure out. But in the end, self-publishing through Amazon seemed to be, even though they're not my favorite corporation, it made it available to people all over the world. So I'm getting, messages all the time from people in Europe, in South America, in Australia. Oh, I just ordered the book on Amazon. Oh, I just got the book, and it's really, so the fact that they're global distribution and print on demand services are just so accessible to people, and it's relatively inexpensive, and yeah, so it all worked out, I think, okay, and yeah, happy to have it out in the world. Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Well, I remember you talking about it even years ago, and seeing why the detail in it is really immaculate. Yours and your other books, Olaf's book. I mean, there's so much coming out right now that just brings it into, well, I guess, accurate historical context. And
Yeah, yeah. No, it's really
very
it's
fascinating.
a feeling of being part of this new like wave of
Yeah.
revelations and research and insight into this that is really exciting. Yeah.
Well, and I know for myself, because I originally learned in 2000 from a little bit more of the mythological version of the history. And then in 2003, when I studied with William Rand, ending up with a more evidence-based history of Reiki, as all of that history was being revealed at the time, Doi Sensei and Arjava Petter and William, and some of the others really involved then. And it was life-changing for me
Yeah.
because it brought in an awareness of just what felt like a more accurate history. It took that mythology feeling out of it,
Yeah.
and made it just a lot more, evidence-based. And
Yeah.
now
I feel
we've
like
got
that
this
was like
new
the first.
wave.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think that was like the first wave was like that like late 90s to early 2000s.
Mhm.
And now it feels like we're going another like the spiral has come around and we're going a little bit deeper. And that's one of the things a lot of people said to me about my book Alternate Currents is that Hawaii Takata, in their lineage, in their spiritual lineage, was held up as this kind of, you know, more than human kind of, like, spiritual teacher. And then I think the pendulum kind of swung and people were like, oh, she made up stuff, she was corrupting the practice. We need to go to the, traditional. And now I think that my book and stuff, really, I think, humanizes her. That's what people have been telling me, that she really seeing her as this remarkable human being, right, who is able
Yes.
to translate the practice to the world, who, obviously dedicated her life to this. That Reiki would not be a global practice without her, but also like trying to think about why did she make some of the choices she made? What was her historical context like? What were her students like? Why did she adapt it in certain ways? And yeah, really trying to understand the history in a more humanistic kind of way, I think. And yeah, so I think I appreciate, I'm always getting nice comments from people about that. So I appreciate, because yeah, it's a lot of work for sure to do all this stuff. And on top of, I have a full-time job as well, that,
Yeah.
research
That.
research is probably my favorite part of my job, that they support me to do some research. But yeah, it's so summertime is like, this is the time when I get to work on new writing and read texts in Japanese and talk to, folks like you about all the exciting stuff I'm working on.
I,
Oh, go ahead, Robin.
I can't imagine the translation process of this because, I mean, even just looking at because it's also spiritual in nature, like just even looking at the word Reiki, how many
Yeah,
different translations the
yeah,
word Reiki has, which is another question that I had about this book, getting into some of the details, because
yeah.
it is, okay, well, I have two additional questions to that kind of story about that translation. One,
Yeah,
and maybe it explained it in the book and I just missed it, is that Reiki is lowercased very often, sometimes uppercased.
right.
Um, and then the other one, kind of related to Reiki, can be translated multiple ways. Different
Hmm.
people translate it different ways.
Yeah,
That in here it says it's a therapy taught by nature. And
yeah,
in the kind of like general translation that we have, it's spiritually guided life
hmm,
force energy. And so I'm curious about that part too. But I wanted to go back to the translation aspect of
sure. Yeah.
spiritual text.
Yes. Okay. So there's a number of things going on there. Let me try to address all of
Sorry.
them. And if I miss anything, let me know. I can
Yeah.
come back. So yeah, the so we chose to just leave when he says Ray, we leave it as Ray. When he says Reiki, we leave it as Reiki. But we're not translating those words, and we're gonna leave it to the reader to encounter it the way that Tomita wrote it, even when it seems a lot of times he uses the term Rei, which like literally means like spirit, maybe, but could also mean, other things like wonderful, mysterious. There's like other meanings of it. Um, that when you read the word day, it could be spirit, right? That is one way to translate it, but it could also mean Reiki. It seems like sometimes he doesn't use the word Reiki and uses the word Rei instead. So instead of trying to like decide for the reader, this is what he meant, we just leave that ambiguity in there a little bit. And so it may, and this was something that Dylan and I, had a long talk about. It may make it a little less of a smooth read, but I feel like it was important to keep some of that ambiguity about what did Tomita actually mean here when he says about awakening Ray in the hands? Like what is that? We'll let that the reader decide on some level, Um, in terms of the capitalization, um, I I'm not 100% sure. I have to go through the manuscript again one more time, but I'm pretty sure at some point there's a footnote that mentions about when it's the practice of Reiki therapy, it's capitalized because it's a proper noun. But when it's the substance day or Reiki, we leave it lowercase and italicized. But then if it's in the title of a section head, it gets capitalized. So that might also be part of like, hey, why is it capitalized there? Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I think any subsection titles would have headline style capitalization. So I think that might be part of that. Um, in terms of, yeah, this is like a spiritual kind of teaching. and thinking about Reiki as like a spiritual guided practice. And then this term of like it's a natural or nature. I think I'm not 100% sure which passage you're thinking about, but I know very early on in the book, he has this term of like great nature, and I think we capitalized it, and like Dai Shizen in Japanese. And again, it's a little mysterious. What exactly is he referring to? But I think it's the way that we talk about like the universe, right? And for spiritual people, right, that has a spiritual connotation, right? That there is like great nature kind of guiding us, right? It's this kind of, or guiding this practice, that it's like the universe itself, heaven and earth, working through our human activities. But also maybe for people who are more materialistic minded, in the philosophical sense, that they can also be like, oh, sure, like I am stardust, like I am a natural being in this natural world. And so maybe it's a way of kind of appealing to both audiences. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, I think the idea of nature as the essence or the source of the practice, um, it also appears in Usui Sensei's own writings in the Kokai Denju Setsume, in the handbook, the public explanation of instruction, which is like the one thing we have from Usui Sensei. It's got the Q&A part as well. But in the first part, where he like kind of addresses a little bit of what Reiki is, he says Reiki is based on, or the therapy is based on um, Reiki that permeates the universe, right? And that all living things, plants, animals, have this, kind of power within them that's a healing power. But humans, as and sometimes translated as like the spiritual heads of creation or something like that. It's the Banbutsu no Reicho, which is an old Japanese expression. But yeah, I mean, literally, it's kind of the wonderful or spiritual heads of all beings. That humans have a particular aptitude for Reiki healing, that we have a particular capacity for it. And so, yeah, I think this idea that Reiki comes like from nature doesn't preclude that it's a spiritual kind of guided practice as well. Yeah, but I think it maybe, I don't know if it was consciously intended to also appeal to people who are maybe turned off by spiritual talk, or I'm not entirely sure about that. Given that other parts of the book, the way he talks about religious practice, right? He talks about gasho meditation. He's like, anybody knows that people who like pray every morning and every evening to the kami and the Buddhas don't get sick, right? Or something. He said something like that. He's like, the religious practice actually helps keep you healthy. And he's like, and that's why Reiki works for the same principle, or something like that. So again, there's this like saying that when you're doing Reiki, it works similarly to prayer. It works similarly to, right, other forms of spiritual practice without being like a religion. And so I think that kind of thing might help inform how to read that like nature aspect as well. Yeah.
Well, nature for me makes equal sense. Life force, and with Usui being raised in a Shinto village. Shintoism is everything has spirit. So, yeah, I think there's that influence in it as well from my own perspective and engagement with it, and the nature of the universe, the nature of creation. Yeah, the great nature. I missed that part. Now that you say it, I remember it. It's like, oh yeah, the great nature. That makes sense too. So the other thing we want to make sure we have time for is to talk about the CV that came out from Taiwan. And just so everybody knows, I really highly recommend that you follow Justin's Facebook page, because he releases so much of this information. He's very generous, thank you, with your information that you share, and other people's information as well. And so follow his Facebook page, and I want to make sure I get it correct. So can you
Yeah,
say
it's
which is the best?
Justin B. Stein Reiki Research.
Justin B. Stein Reiki
Yeah,
Research.
I also get a lot of like personal, like 'cause my personal page is also called Justin B. Stein. So a lot of people are like friending me on Facebook. I'm like, no, no, go to my Reiki page because I don't know you. Like I don't want to share my vacation photos with you necessarily. Like
Right.
go to my Reiki research page, yeah, if you don't follow me already there. Yeah.
Okay, good,
Yeah,
because that is where so much of this information you can find it and, book titles. And I know you talk about Olaf's book and how to find it and, all of the CV and then the new information coming out. So,
yeah, and these interviews and everything I'm working on Reiki related, I share there and yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So, anyway, so back to the CV. Can you talk about that and what
sure.
that exactly is, where it came from, and also what it's revealing in just like that one page, a little bit more than one page, but a short document.
Yeah. So it's amazing. The all these things kind of happen at the same time sometimes.
Mm.
But the I was contacted, I believe in March or April, by this Taiwanese Reiki practitioner who I had met before. I'd met him in Japan. We had connected there. But he contacted me about this basically a file of documents that had been created in 1904 in the Japanese colonial government archive in Japan. I'm sorry, in Taiwan. That the Japan had colonized Taiwan in 1895, and that they had hired this new employee, Usui Mikao. And so at the time, he was 39 years old, and they had some information about him, in the file. But the most amazing thing in this file was this handwritten CV. Um, yeah, it's a couple of pages long. And it includes basically all of his education and work experience up to that point. And one of the things about Usui Sensei is we have this kind of lack of information about a lot of aspects of his life, outside of the stories that were told about him in the oral history, coming out of his lineage. And so having all of this new data about the schools he attended, about his study abroad in the US, about his working in schools in Japan, including this Christian school that he helped found in Tokyo. It it doesn't exactly accord with all of the information in the oral history and in the Hawaii Takada's story about him, but it certainly resonates with it in some important ways. It helps corroborate some of the information, the idea that he was a Christian teacher, for example, the idea that he studied in the U.S., the idea that as it says also in the Memorial Stone and some other documents, that he had studied in China. It seems that Taiwan was, I mean, the other thing though is that because he from the documents that Min Wang and his associates have uncovered, it seems that Usui stayed in Taiwan from 1904 to 1911, and then he started teaching Reiki in 1922. The oral history says that before, and not just oral history. There's another document that I'd like to talk about too. The Okuna. This is other book that we've recently found by this writer Okuna. That it says that he had practiced Zen in a Zen temple for 3 years prior to his experience at Kurama. So let's say from 1911 to 1919 or so, we don't know what Usui Sensei was up to. Maybe he went back to the U.S. Maybe he did, work at Doshisha University. Maybe he went to mainland China to continue some other aspect of his studies there. We don't really know for that 8 years. But the fact that we now know, basically up to 1911, kind of what Usui Sensei was up to, it's, for people interested in Reiki history and the life of Usui, it's, certainly one of the most important discoveries we've ever had. Yeah.
Yes, and just so anybody wants to know, you can find that on Justin's Facebook page.
Yeah, I think you
And
might have to
it
scroll
has
back
been
a few posts
republished.
now.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Mhm. You might just have to scroll back a few posts. But yeah,
Yeah.
I have a full translation of the CV there, as well as some kind of, I think, updates about some follow-up research I did, trying to find out. For example, it mentions that he worked for an American women's missionary society in Japan and set up a school in Fukagawa, Tokyo, which was a very poor neighborhood at the time. It was in the kind of downtown, and I found some documents that even refer to it as a slum. And the trying to follow up on my research. Um, it does the Women's Foreign Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which later became the Methodist Church, um, had a school that opened up in Fukagawa around that time. The amount of money in their records that was requisitioned for that school is $100 more than what his salary said it was. So it's like quite possible, like I have to dig it more into their records, but it's quite possible that was the organization that he had worked for and that he built, basically a Methodist church Methodist school in Tokyo for boys to receive like a Christian education in Tokyo, which of course for people familiar with the Takata story, right? She says he was the headmaster of a Christian boys school, some versions of the story, she says principal of Doshisha University, but other versions just says, the head of a Christian boys' school. So I don't know. In her story, it was in Kyoto. So I don't know, is this the end all be all of his Christian educator career? There may have been another school later, but at the very least, it does help give some credence to that. Um, this says in the CV that he studied at the Hooking School in the US. And I am not sure what the Hooking School is, but it does mention also in the CV that he studied under a psychologist, a very pioneering experimental psychologist in Japan named Motora Yujiro. And Motora Yujiro had studied at Johns Hopkins. And it's possible Hokkingu is his, kind of mistransliteration of Hopkin. I don't know. Like it's so I've tried looking into that. Unfortunately, he doesn't appear in any. They have a pretty good documentation of all the students who were enrolled around that time. Doesn't seem like he was enrolled there, but it's possible he was auditing classes, right? I mean, it's who we don't know. So I'm again, I have a few threads that I want to continue to research, but it's very exciting for someone like me who's dedicated their life to trying to figure these things out, to have all of these new avenues for potential future research, as well as just having this document itself, in Usui Sensei's own hand. It's signed by him. You can compare the signature. I have this on my Facebook page. Compare the signature on the CV to the signature on the Gokai, the five precepts document that we also have from him, which was previously the only other thing that we had in his own handwriting. And yeah, they do. I mean, I'm not a graphologist, but they do seem to match up pretty well, I think. Yeah, so that's quite exciting. Yeah, I don't know if you have other questions about that, or I could also transition into the.
Well, yeah, I
Sure.
loved just reading the kind of flow of his life and the different
Yeah,
things that he studied, because there are elements of it that I also did learn in that history
yeah,
that like, oh, okay, maybe this is where that tied in, some of why it came out the way it did. Because like you with Mrs. Takata, I just feel like she was an incredibly innovative woman following her guidance. And I've always believed that with
yeah.
her, even in the early days of the transition from the history as we knew it, that like, wow, what amazing just guidance that she received and then had the courage to teach and promote.
Oh, and travel as a, a
Oh,
single Asian American, elder woman traveling all over the US, going to Puerto Rico, she went to Indonesia, she went to Japan. I mean, incredibly strong. And everyone who studied with her says the same, that she's a very strong woman. Yeah. Yeah.
I like the way you said that.
Yes. And a number of people mentioned she was like a drill sergeant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, I bet. Well,
yeah.
probably to have that level of capacity to do what she did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Because a lot of the things I feel like I learned in 2000 even were developed after she passed. So I don't think even everything that I learned about the history, some of the practices and things that I learned in 2000, I think some of that was also
Mhm.
brought into the system of Reiki
It
between
was a
19,
game of telephone. Yeah.
just as it all goes. And fortunately, we get to have the evolution of Reiki. And I love that even in Tomita's book, he
Mm.
talks about that right off the bat. Like that's in some of the beginning chapters,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
you say, kind of written throughout, but also listen to your own way.
Right. Yeah. And also one of the things I mentioned, I'm glad you brought it back to Tomita because I realized there was one more thing that we didn't say. So he doesn't give a lot of information about Usui in the book, but the one thing that he really says about Usui Sensei's teachings is that they are based on the coming and going or the circulation of yin and yang. And that's
Yeah.
something we don't see anywhere else. And he says it, I believe, twice in the book about the coming and going of yin and yang, the circulation of yin and yang. And it's certainly, I think, something we see in Reiki, right? And the idea of balance and circulation and, that we see in the memorial stone and also in the CV that Usui Sensei studied classical Chinese, that he was interested in kind of classics, that he studied psychology and Western philosophy and medicine and history, but he also studied, ancient Chinese teachings of, the Taoist sages and the immortals and magic and all that. So the idea that Tomita's like big takeaway from Usui is that Reiki works via the circulation or the coming and going of yin and yang. I think that's really an interesting tidbit from his book as well that I think helps give a new dimension maybe to Usui's teaching. Maybe some things that kind of come through the oral tradition, but weren't written down anywhere else that I know of at that time. That there's a kind of yin yang aspect to Reiki. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I remember reading it and connecting in and then moved on, of course, to the rest of the book. But that is such a good explanation for it, right? Like you say, bringing it into today's perspective of what that actually means with the energy to be able to actually invite it and learn
Yeah.
more about that
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, I think it's, also part of this idea that it brings whatever you need, right? That if you have too much inflammation, it cools you down, right? If you are stagnant, it can warm you up, right? That it complements the needs in the recipient, um, right? That it's not a yin energy or a yang energy. It's this kind of balancing, harmonizing energy in a way. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because we still talk about it in that way. It
Right.
promotes balance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
It's one of the
exactly.
things when we just recorded a podcast with Kay and Fink, and she's the one that is in the university hospitals in Cleveland. And she was saying how they describe it there. It's an integrative modality or therapy to help bring balance and well-being. And so, I mean, it's just such a common way that we talk about it. So that's
Yeah,
really interesting that that is another place that you can kind of find that support around it.
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And also the tying it into kind of, Sino-Japanese, East Asian
Yeah.
conceptions of chi or ki.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it's nice to have, for me, like a data point, but like for practitioners, maybe like a reassurance, like, yes, this
Yeah.
does come out of this kind of East Asia, even though there are maybe modern aspects, there are, Buddhist aspects, there may be some kind of Christian influences, but there's also this, strong East Asian lineage, these practitioners understood themselves to be in. And also, like I mentioned, even in the title, Reiki to Jinjutsu, right? Like Reiki and benevolence, that the idea that this is a healing art that's understood in the way that medicine has been understood in China and Japan for thousands of years, right? That the physician as a caregiver, and the Reiki practitioner as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you also said that you are starting on a new project, and you said the name of it beforehand, which is so beautiful. I can't wait to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I'm working again with University of Hawaii Press. They haven't signed a contract or anything, but they're interested in it. And so it's like a follow-up to my book in a sense. And it comes out of a conference, an online conference that we had in 2022, which was 100 years after the founding of the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. The book, I don't know exactly what year it'll come out. Next year is 100 years since Usui Sensei's passing. That would be nice if it was out in 2026, but the peer review process for academic publications takes a while, so no promises. But yeah, the title, working title at least, is A Century of Reiki, and I'm actually writing the introduction right now. It's what I've been working on the last couple of weeks, and I think so. The book will have, I think, 9 or 10 chapters. My introduction, I'm hoping, will be like a really accessible and informative kind of state of the field. What do we know about Reiki? Where did it come from? How has it changed over time? So because I've always been like, oh, I really should write something like that. So I'm trying to make the introduction kind of like that. And then a few chapters about the context of the time that Usui Sensei lived in, talking about other spiritual therapies at that time. The next few chapters talking about some of the evolution of Usui Reiki Ryoho, and how did it change over time? How did new branches come up? There's a chapter actually specifically about Reiki in Brazil. That's about kind of how was it introduced to Brazil? How has it changed since it's been there? It's also been integrated into the state healthcare system and hospitals there. And so a bit about that, which I think is great because we don't have so much written about Reiki in the global South, at least in English. And so I think that's a really great contribution. And then the last few chapters are about, they're written by social scientists, and so looking at Reiki in the contemporary world. One is about kind of the incorporation of Reiki into one's everyday life, and how kind of miracles become ordinary and ordinary things become miraculous, and that kind of thing. One is about Reiki in contemporary Japan, and how other spiritual therapies now like refer to Reiki in like their own, like it's like, oh, it's like Reiki. That Reiki becomes like the baseline kind of foundation for understanding maybe body work or energy work. And the other one is about scientific research on Reiki, and ways that like Reiki both is accessible but also maybe resists scientific understanding. And so yeah, I think it should be a really interesting book. I love working with all these folks, and yeah, so hopefully that's, I don't know if it's going to be next year or the following year, but in the next couple of years, that should be another great resource, I think, for the community, as well as hopefully for scholars as well interested in
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and then what about the other one you said, the flute of the universe?
Okay, so that's a source. And yeah, I'm going to be translating that. I'm working on a translation. This is another thing that's been like on my back burner for years. I have a lot of different sources that I've translated over time. Some of them I've made available on my academia.edu page, which maybe we could also share in the show notes.
Yes.
So I have some translations that are available there. I have some translations in Robert Fuston's book that came out in 2017.
I have it
Um,
right here.
and yeah, and so in the appendices, I have a few articles from Japanese language newspapers that I translated in there. But I want to make kind of like a source book of kind of translations of all the different Japanese language sources, historical sources. And so this is one of them. I, it's a weird story where I've actually had this PDF in my hard drive for a few years now, and I looked at it and I was like, oh, this is cool. And then I just kind of forgot about it maybe. And I received it from my teacher, Yoshinaga Sensei, who unfortunately passed away. But I am happy that I finally kind of took him up on it and am like, because it's really an important source for, again, like documenting what had previously kind of been in the oral history, but it gives more historical corroboration for some of those things. So the book is called, it's from a book called, yeah, as you said, the Voice of Heaven's Flute, Tenrai no Koe, and it was published in 1928. So just a couple of years after Usui Sensei passed. And the author, again, seems to have met and studied with Usui Sensei. And it has, in addition to him telling his own experiences with Reiki, and also a very in-depth kind of reflection on and explanation of the five precepts, which is the part that I'm still kind of struggling with, part of that. But the early part of his chapter on Reiki therapy gives an explanation of Usui Sensei's biography. And there are aspects there that, again, resonate with the other sources that we had before, particularly parts of it with Hawayo Takada's story, that there are a lot of details in this text, again, written in 1928 in Japan, that are like details just the way Hawayo Takada told them. For example, I have it right here so I can read a little bit from it. It talks about him after 3 weeks of fasting, losing consciousness and collapsing, and then being revived and having this new like spiritual sensitivity he talks about, and having this confidence that he could heal disease. That's a little different from Takada, because in Takada, he doesn't know that he has the power until he puts his hands on. But then it says, unroot home. He stumbled on a stone, and his toe bled profusely. But when he touched it with his hand, the bleeding stopped immediately, right? Which is like right from her story. Later, when Sensei stopped at a tea house for breakfast, the young woman there suffered from a toothache. So he touched her and healed her, right? Again, it's like what she said. Um, and then I think there's actually one more, like what she called healing miracles, that I don't think was in her story, where he says, upon returning home, he also healed the housemaid's stomach cramps. But then he says, furthermore, the Zen master had suffered from rheumatism for many years, but it was cured immediately by a touch of his hand. So again, like these stories that were in the Takata story, which we didn't really have anywhere else, the toothache, the Zen master's backache, right? Those are things that she talked about, and it turns out they were written in 1928 in this book, and we just, it was waiting all this time for us to discover it. So that's really nice. And then the other thing I really love from this section is he talks about Usui Sensei's, powers or abilities result from harmonizing the spirit of the macrocosm, Dai Uchu no Re, like the great universe's spirit, with his own spirit, Jiko no Re. And so again, this microcosm, macrocosm, harmonizing the self and the spirit, spiritual self with the spirit of the universe. Very similar again with the individual mind and the divine mind. Yeah, to have that there, it's another really kind of beautiful passage that I think also resonates with some of these other materials we have. So.
Will you be publishing that soon?
I don't know. I think I still need to work. I have a bunch of things I'm working on this summer,
Yeah, exactly.
and there, as I said, there's some parts of the. Oh, but you know what? It's in Olaf's book. Part of it is.
Okay, I was
Yeah.
looking
The
at that
biographical
discussion.
part of it, I don't know the pages off the top of my head. Maybe I can find it quickly. But the biographical part of it, it's translated in Olaf's book. That he had someone um, kind of improve upon my initial translation. Yeah, here it is. It's on pages 80 to 81 in
Okay.
yeah, Olaf Bohm, Reiki, A Journey to Oneness with the Universe. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. Boy, I feel like I've read that
Yeah.
already.
But
So
that was the first place that was translated. But then there's more to the chapter that I haven't released yet. That's
it
as I
is.
said, it mostly is about the Gokai, the five precepts. Yeah.
Well, that was something that I did read in Olaf's book. And, we just interviewed him too, and his podcast will come out soon, um, in a couple of weeks after this one. But also, I don't know where I missed it. I did not realize that the Gokai was not part of Emperor Meiji's um, prayers.
It's a common mix-up, in
Yes.
part because the way that it's written in the memorial stone was mistranslated. It's a little ambiguous in the memorial stone. Japanese is a very context-dependent language, and so it's really easy to get mixed up about certain things because of the grammar sometimes is not super clear. But the way that it's written on the memorial stone, it says something about we morning and evening put our hands in gasho, recite the Gokai, and also the Meiji Emperor's writings. But depending on how you read it, it could be and recite the Gokai, the teachings of the Meiji Emperor, or something like that. And so I think there were some translations of the memorial stone that came out, 25 years ago or something, where it was like, oh, the Gokai is the teaching of the Meiji Emperor. And so that was kind of I think a misunderstanding that circulated for a while. Yeah, the teachings of the Meiji Emperor are the gyosei, are the poetry, and the Gokai is something separate that Usui Sensei seems to have adapted from this other teacher, Suzuki Bizan, who is the one I mentioned before, who studied Christian Science in Boston. Yeah, because he has a very similar one in his book that this has been written about a few places, including in my book, but also a article by Hirano Naoko that's available for free on the internet. It's very good, where she like literally has like all these different versions of this poem or these precepts like side by side. And so in Suzuki's version, it's just for today, don't get angry, don't be afraid, be grateful. Oh no, be honest. He has be honest instead of be grateful, and then do your work well. Be kind to people. And Usui, right? It's don't get angry, don't worry, be grateful, right? So the Usui changed those two, but they're pretty close. Don't be afraid, don't worry, be honest, be grateful. I guess is the biggest change. Yeah. But yeah, it seems like he adapted that from this guy Bizan, who had studied the affirmation stuff. So yeah, the Phyllis also had the same thing where she was saying something about, oh, the Gokai came from the Meiji Emperor, and I was like, no, they're two different things. And she was like, you see. 'Cause she had had the memorial stone translated in the 90s, and in her translation, it kind of suggested that, and she said, "You see, that's the one thing that I started teaching that's not what my grandmother taught, and it was wrong. I'm never changing my teachings again. I should never have done that, So, yeah.
Can you also just give an explanation of the Emperor Meiji's poems because we talk around it, but
Mhm.
for those who may not really know what
Yeah.
we're talking about.
Sure. So, waka poetry is a big part of Japanese culture. You're probably more familiar with haiku, the 575, syllable poem. Waka is a longer poem from which haiku was derived, so it's 57577. And it's a style of poem that's been popular in Japan, since for over 1,000 years, let's just say, and that a big part of like being a cultured person in Japan. Sorry, I had WhatsApp open and my dad was calling me. A big part of being a cultured person in Japan was being able to spontaneously compose waka poems. There would be like poetry parties. It was almost like freestyle hip hop, in like medieval Japan. And so the Meiji emperor and also his wife, the empress, each wrote poems every day. Over, I think, the course of about 40 years, he wrote something like 100,000 poems. He has a huge catalog of poems that he wrote. And it was part of what they did every day was just write poetry. And there are many, many collections of his poems. And one thing that helps distinguish, I think, Usui Reiki Ryoho in that period as a spiritual practice was the practice of Hatsureho, right, which has this right. There's the dry bathing, right, the kind of purification that happens at the beginning, the Joshin Kokyuho, this breathing practice to purify the self by breathing light in from the heavens into your lower belly, expanding that light, kind of creating this like non-dual union of the self and the universe. The Gasho meditation, where you bring your hands to Gasho and breathe the light through your body and out through the hands. And this is all described also in the Tomita book as well. And then the recitation of these poems, the gyosei. Often, I think it's just you kind of pick one poem from a collection of these poems, and that the words, the vibration of the words, the meaning, the teaching in the poem are supposed to help to purify your heart, mind, your kokoro, and to be able to be a better channel for Reiki, right? That the purer you are, the better, the easier Reiki is going to come through you. And so many of the poems they kind of, I think, have a few different themes that are common. One of them is about kind of, you have to work at self-cultivation every day. Don't let dust accumulate on the jewel of our hearts kind of thing. One of them, I think, is about kind of just exaltation of how beautiful the world and nature are. And, I wish that my heart was as pure as the sky when the sun is coming up kind of vibe. But there's other ones that are like more like moral and kind of about how to be a good person, about honesty, about hard work. And then, as I mentioned, some of the ones that were so in Olaf's book, he has this collection of 100 gyosei that were apparently distributed in the Gakkai during Usui Sensei's lifetime. He has a copy of the book that has a publication date of January 1926, and Usui Sensei made his transition in March 1926. So at least near the end of Usui Sensei's life, there was this book circulated in the Gakkai. And as I mentioned, the ones that are in the Tomita book are also in there. So it seems that Tomita was receiving them as well. And yeah, that includes some of these more like kind of patriotic about the Japanese people, the spirit of the Japanese people as well. And yeah, so Rika Saruhashi did very nice translations of those poems. They're very difficult to translate. I think they're very poetic. I was surprised by maybe some of the choices that she made in terms of her translations, but I think they read well, and I think she captures a lot of the spiritual meanings in there. But the thing is, I think about the poems is there's different ways to read them, and I'm not my Meiji period grammar isn't always good enough to understand all the nuances of them, so I've never tried to undertake translating them myself. And so I'm happy for people like Rika. And yeah, she also has another book. So the one in here is the 100 poems from the 1926 book. But as I mentioned, after the war, they changed the poems. And so there's a more, I think, famous 125 poem collection from the post-war Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai Handbook. And that's been translated a number of times, I think including in Frank R. Java Petter's books, but also Rika, who did these ones, also just, I think, had a new book come out with that 125 translated as well. So there's a number of different versions circulating, and which have different collections of poems. There's certain ones that seem to have been very central that like are in all of the collections, but then there's other ones around, and also if you just look online, there's other collections of Meiji Emperor, the Emperor Meiji's waka poetry that you can find. So if you're interested in that topic, there's definitely a whole rabbit hole you can go down. Yeah.
Well, I've of course read them and seen them and never really gone down that rabbit hole, but now they're so accessible with
Yeah,
everything that all of you are bringing out and with the
yeah.
translations that it's easier to go down that rabbit hole. So,
Sure. And some
yeah.
people really like to, chant them in Japanese and get that resonance. Other people say, no, it's really about inspiring your heart or inspiring your mind. So chant them in English, chant them in Spanish, chant them in whatever language is natural for you. Or it can just be more of a meditation. I think different people use them in different ways, for sure.
Yeah, I'm probably between interest, curiosity, and then, using it again for daily life.
Yeah. I've seen also, I don't know if there's like a set of cards that people have, but I've seen at like Reiki gatherings where they have them printed out on pieces of paper and you like reach in and grab one and pull it out and that's your like fortune cookie, I don't know, for the day. Like that's and I think that's also maybe a nice practice, like a random gyosei generator to give you a little guidance for the day or something like that.
Oh, I love that. That'd be a great thing to do at the Reiki retreat.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
Well, Justin, as always, this is just fantastic and full of just such beautiful and rich information and history. Let's repeat where people can find you, both your website and your Facebook.
Sure. So yeah, Facebook, Justin B. Stein Reiki Research. And I also have a website, justinstein.academia.edu. And that has various publications that I've put out. It's not all Reiki, but there's a bunch of Reiki stuff on there for sure.
And we'll, of course, put that in the show notes. So you can just go and click the links. Also, this book is Reiki and the Benevolent Art of Healing. So we'll put the link to that in the show notes, and then also Alternate Currents, which is his other book that we had you on. Colleen, do you want to hold that one up? I don't have it in front of me.
I have it right here.
Oh, and you have it too, right in front of you, Justin. Yeah. And that one you can find in again, different bookshops and Amazon. And also isn't that one on your website, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, just some information about it. Yeah, you could
Oh,
find it.
okay. Yeah.
But
So
yeah, I think that one, depending on what country you live in, if you live in the US, you should be able to get your local bookstore to order it for you.
yeah,
Overseas, it might be easier to buy it directly from the publisher or from Amazon. Yeah.
directly from the publisher. That's what I was remembering
Yeah.
from before.
University of Hawaii Press.
Yeah, that's right. And again, we'll put those links into the show notes as well.
Great.
So I see you trying to say something, Colleen.
Oh, I was just going to say, Justin, just share a little bit also about the other things that you do and what you've written that people will find on your website, because really
Oh,
a
you know,
very
yeah.
expanded, um,
I'm researching Japanese religion from a transnational perspective in the modern period. So I've written a bit about modern Buddhist history as well. But I also have a recent article that Reiki folks might be interested in as well, about Aikido and the spiritual aspects of Aikido. And there's even and also how it came to the United States, and the understandings of ki, as that the kind of predominant translation of ki is as energy, but I'm showing this as kind of alternate, maybe lineage of understanding ki as mind. And so this article looks at particularly the lineage of ki aikido of Tohei Sensei, and the kind of idea that ki is mind. And there's one section of the article also that compares the movement of Aikido from Japan, or the development of Aikido in Japan and its movement to the US with that of Reiki. So I think Reiki folks might be interested in that one as well.
Is Aikido a martial art?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, it's a martial art, but they say it's the martial art of love. So it's not just supposed to be for fighting, but for self-cultivation and it's kind of a spiritual practice. There's different lineages. Some of them are more martial, and some of them are more art. Let's say, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, as we always say, we could talk for hours. We have. And thank you again so much. And thank you for all the work. There was one other thing I wanted to mention is be sure you reach out if you are doing future fundraisers, because our listeners, I know, would want to support any of the fundraisers for the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I know that the Tomita book, there's currently translation projects from now taking the English translation and creating French, Spanish, Dutch. I'm not sure the German one has been signed yet, Polish, Russian. And so I know that some of those translators are doing their own fundraiser projects as well. And so I could try to find out some information about that and pass those along if people are, particularly if you have listeners who, want to support a particular language, the Tomita book coming out in Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or something, that there are these projects going on, and I think those translators need, some of them, are obviously volunteering their time, but
Sure.
it would be helpful to help pay them as well.
Yeah, some of the support
Yeah.
and we're all just benefiting so much from the information. So thank you. So
Thank
yes,
you.
please
Thank you
pass
both.
that forward, anything that,
Okay.
doesn't add a lot more to your list of
Okay.
your very long list of things to do.
No, thank you both so much. I always love talking to you, and yeah, thanks for the invitation to come back, and hopefully again sometime
Yep.
before too long.
Yeah.
Anytime
Anytime.
whenever you have something else you want to share. We love
Thanks.
it. All right, and thank you to all the listeners. Robin, anything
Yep.
else?
Nope. I think that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye bye.